they're one of the players. They're one of the leading players in the Western markets. But there's still, a lot of potential for other players to kind of come through on top, or similarly for Tesla to kind of run away with things and be the all-out leader. Tesla's been the most ambitious in terms of its production capacity plans. So that really does set them in quite a good position for, taking some level of kind of market dominance or leadership in the US and Western markets.
Today, you're going to hear from Iola Hughes, the research manager at Row Motion. Row is a research house and consultancy in London, set up about 5 years ago, and Iola has been there for 4 of them. They provide data and market analysis focused on the EV battery and energy storage markets, and even things like charging, recycling, and EV motors. Their team of 30 is growing quickly around the globe with analysts in places like China, Korea, and others. Iola and I eased into the conversation, so hopefully everyone can follow along. Use the timestamps if you would like. Please consider dropping an early like to say thank you to Iola for making the time for us, and I'd appreciate it too. Enjoy. Kind of getting right into it, can you just give us a quick overview of some of the main use cases and applications for battery storage, and maybe touch specifically on the software side, because I think that's where some people may not be as informed.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the kind of use cases for stationary storage are really quite wide and quite versatile. So when we think about storage, we broadly kind of classify it into 2 key areas. So on one side, you have kind of grid storage, which is front of the meter. And then the other side, you have behind the meter storage. So firstly, on the grid side of the market, here you kind of have 2 key places where storage is being installed. So the first one is renewable paired storage, so say at a solar farm or a wind farm, and directly connecting battery storage to sit alongside that generation asset. The other side of grid storage is basically connected to transmission or distribution networks, and these operate more as kind of a standalone system, and they get involved in a number of different applications on the grid and serve the grid in a number of different ways. And then on the other side of the market, you have behind the meter applications. These tend to be smaller batteries, and this encompasses everything from residential solar and storage, so anyone installing, say, kind of Powerwall in their home, all the way through to things like telecoms, backup power, data centers using UPS, hospitals using backup power, factory lines. So really there is quite a wide range of applications within that area. In terms of the software, I guess maybe the way that a lot of the market works is, primarily what you've got in a system is in battery cells. Often these are, bought in from someone else. So some of the big players in this market, they tend to be called integrators, because they're people who kind of take cells and put them into packs and then sell them in systems. So for example, like Tesla does. So essentially you have people who are manufacturing cells. These then get supplied to integrators. So this could be a player like Tesla or a player like Fluence, who are essentially taking these kind of racks of cells or batteries and putting them into a larger unit and then selling on. And that's where they're kind of doing a lot of the software work. So, managing the BMS, the battery management system, and ensuring that everything works in a kind of larger system. And then the next part of the supply chain are the integrator, are the developers. So these are the people who are maybe purchasing systems from someone like Tesla or someone like Fluence, and then installing them in the ground and managing that asset once these are in the ground. You do have quite a few players who are getting involved in kind of all 3 parts of this supply chain. So Tesla operates primarily in the kind of integrator space. So they're the people who are purchasing cells from elsewhere and then integrating them into a system. But you have other players who are, building cells and building systems. So a lot of the Chinese players, for example, so CATL, they produce their own cells, but then they also produce systems as well. And then you have some players who are involved in the developer space as well. So probably the biggest one there is LG. So LG, they produce their own cells. They also produce their own systems, and they acquired a company called NEC, I think it was about a year ago, and are involved in the kind of developer space as well. So kind of across all 3 parts of that supply chain.
Okay. So do you have a simple, quick rule of thumb for the behind the meter, front of the meter? Because I've seen many different explanations of what that means.
Yeah, I mean, generally the way that we consider it is in front of the meter or grid is kind of directly connected into the transmission grid. So the idea there is being it really is supplying the wider electricity grid and being part of integrated into that. With the behind the meter applications, these can often operate more as almost like a localized microgrid. So they're not necessarily interacting with the wider electricity grid, is the kind of key differentiator there. And then one of the big things is generally size. So for grid applications, you're generally looking at a lot larger batteries than what you'd see on the behind the meter side.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks for that. So is it fair to say that replacing peaker plants is one of the primary, if not the primary application for battery storage right now, or are we seeing a much wider use case than just that?
So it's definitely one of the applications, probably one of the big things now, and particularly in the US market, one of the big kind of drivers for storage in the last few years has been storage was eligible for an investment tax credit when it was paired with solar. So the majority of storage being installed was being installed directly connected to solar farms. So the real kind of primary application there is more on the energy arbitrage side. So essentially, if you can charge up your battery, you can basically sell it back to the grid when prices are the highest and make the most money out of it. So that being one of the big ones, and then also just providing resiliency for those renewable assets and ensuring that you can supply to the grid for a longer period of time. So yeah, probably the biggest one right now is really just around how can we make the most money, and the economic case. If that's there, then people are going to install batteries. The peaker plant area is definitely a big growing market, and in some regions in particular, that's really being considered as a good future option. So in the Australian market, for example, they have quite ambitious plans for kind of phase down of coal plants and phase down of gas plants, and a lot of facilities that were previously coal plants or gas plants. The plan is to, once these get decommissioned or in the process of decommissioning them, to install batteries kind of in situ there. The idea being you already have grid connection in place, and it brings down the cost somewhat of rather than finding a new site and building the whole grid connection, you can skip that step.
Gotcha. Okay. So you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. It's been talked about ad nauseum as of late, but for good reason. So can you maybe give us a simple explanation of the difference between the investment tax credit and the producer tax credit? Because I think these get conflated fairly often.
Yeah. So firstly, on the ITC, the investment tax credit side of things. So this is something which has been in place for a number of years. And what the IRA did was essentially kind of extended it and also expanded it. So the ITC, which was in place historically, was for solar and also for storage paired with solar. So essentially what it does is it provides money for, the upfront capex of the installation. So you're providing a discount to the developer to install a project. What it did with the extension, essentially extended that for another 5 years. So kind of out to 2025, 2027, projects can get access to this. And what it did as well was expanded it to include standalone storage assets. So no longer did the battery storage have to be installed next to a solar farm. So that really expands the number of applications which the battery can get involved in. It also, it opens up new business streams of revenue, and is quite promising for developers. In terms of kind of the amount of money you can get there is pretty significant as well. So as a baseline, essentially you have a 30% capex kind of saving. And then there's kind of add-ons you can get, which bring that up to 50% if you meet certain requirements, such as building in an area where economic is not as economically strong, or there's a brownfield site, or is basically an area which previously had fossil fuel industries kind of acting there. So there's a lot of money to kind of get to just on the installation side. And on the back of that, we've seen quite a lot of projects being announced, or more projects coming through in the US market in the last few months. On the other side of the picture, you have the production tax credit. So this is really more focused on the actual kind of manufacturing of batteries and manufacturing of systems. So there's two parts to it. So on one side, you have for the battery cell production. So this is $35 per kilowatt hour kind of credit. And then on top of that, there is a $10 per kilowatt hour for pack assembly. So with this part, essentially, we've seen a lot of kind of excitement around particularly this $10 part. So, I mean, using Tesla as an example, so they purchase cells from CATL for their Megapacks, but they're purchasing cells and they then assemble them into their own packs. So essentially, they can tap into that $10 part of the production tax credit and get access to that. I think the idea down the line is, of course, get into the cell side of things as well, and then you can get that $35 as well. But definitely in the last few months, we've seen a whole lot of activity from energy storage players in the US market, both from the cell side. So we're seeing quite a few dedicated energy storage cell facilities or gigafactories being set up, but we're also seeing quite a lot more assembly and system assembly being set up, as well as announcements to move into packs. So quite an interesting one being Fluence. So they historically they've just kind of they've bought packs from elsewhere and done just a system assembly. So done really the power conversion systems and the BMS and build the finished system. But they announced that in their Utah facility, they're going to be getting into doing the packs as well. So, tap into that $10 part as everyone really wants to.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So is it accurate to say then that when and if Tesla chooses to use those 4680 cells from Austin or Cato Road in the United States, then they would be eligible for the full $45 per kilowatt hour credit for like the Megapack specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the cells coming out of Cato Road, wherever they go, whether they end up in EV or stationary, they're going to be able to get those production tax credits. So right now, they don't really care where those batteries are going to end up because they're going to tap into those credits. I think, at some point, either expanding that line or getting into LFP production as well, which is really the chemistry of choice for storage right now. It would make sense to maybe move away from CATL as a supplier so they can access those tax credits as well.
Mm-hmm. So are there any caps on what a company like Tesla can earn with these tax credits?
There doesn't seem to be a cap in that sense. So, I mean, some of the figures that are being thrown around in terms of what these gigafactories are going to be getting just on like an annualized basis are pretty massive. So yeah, no real upper limit there to the amount of money they'll be receiving. Of course, kind of policy can change and things can change down the line. But right now it's, if you can produce the cells, you're going to get a good amount of money.
Okay, awesome. So is it also true then that the numbers that are given in the Inflation Reduction Act, like from the budgeting side, those aren't really caps. Those are just kind of estimates. So if there are enough qualifying projects, the numbers could exceed those.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually did some analysis on that in terms of, that figure that was put out, I think it was around 370 billion. We did some kind of back of the envelope calculations on that in terms of what had been announced just for kind of the EV and battery markets. And, these targets are exceeding, the figures are exceeding by quite a lot. And that's without even thinking about the other industries which are also going to benefit from the IRA. So, of course, the solar industry is a massive beneficiary as well. And the production tax credit for the solar industry is also huge. So you can tap into, if you're producing wafers, if you're producing ingots, you can get certain amounts for each kilowatt you're producing as well. So it's a big pot of money, but the figure that has been kind of put out maybe is not quite as accurately high as it's going to be.
Gotcha. Okay. And then can you touch on the importance of the Inflation Reduction Act now allowing these credit transfers, and specifically how we have cash for credits that may be great for entities that have a tax liability, but now this may be opened up to a much wider market with the direct pay option where, maybe entities that don't have a tax liability can now benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act and these credits?
Yeah, I think the big thing here being kind of the ability to access money sooner. So rather having to go through the process of making a kind of tax reclaim, you can kind of tap into these savings and get these direct payments sooner. It does allow a lot more players to kind of benefit from them more immediately, and also access the market sooner.
Okay, awesome. So I hear a lot about you mentioned it earlier, how you don't have to have these battery storage projects connected to renewable anymore. So is that really a huge deal? And can you kind of add some color into how big of a deal that is, and maybe what rough percentage of projects now are moving forward that are not actually tied to a renewable source?
I mean, I don't have I can maybe send you afterwards some facts, and you can add them in terms of the percentage that are unpaired. But we're definitely going to see more of them going forwards, just because you can now access the tax credit without having to worry about pairing them. It really just does open up the projects to a number of new revenue streams, being kind of the main thing. So, I mean, being able to install maybe where the grid is kind of the most congested. So rather than an area where you have a solar farm, you can look at areas in the grid or areas in the electricity network which maybe need kind of storage to help with grid congestion, can be very beneficial. So that's probably the biggest thing, just kind of tapping into new revenue streams. And then, I mean, there's a number of other services you can get involved in, kind of like ancillary services. So just like balancing constant changes in frequency or balancing voltage. And that can also do things. So rather than, in some cases where you need to do an upgrade to the grid, you can instead install batteries there. And that could basically, help deal with some of the congestion and help smooth some of that load. Which can be pretty beneficial as well.
A lot of us in the Tesla community, we are trying to like gauge what the market looks like. A lot of people throw around the term unlimited total addressable market when it comes to battery
Yeah.
storage and Tesla deploying the Megapack. So a lot of us we just try to get an understanding of, okay, what's being replaced, what type of companies are looking to buy this product, and things along those lines. So
I mean, I think peak plants is a good one to consider, but probably one of the biggest indicators that we look at is more in terms of thinking about how are renewables being added to the grid. So in certain markets, you have a bit more clarity around how this is going to behave. So in China in particular, they have pretty direct legislation in place now for storage. So that comes in kind of different forms. So each province in China has its own kind of standard or level that it's set. But these tend to kind of be between basically somewhere in the range of saying 10 to 15% of storage at a 1 to 2 hour duration with renewables. So the idea being, if you install 10 megawatts of solar, you have to also install 10 to 15% of that as a battery with a 1 to 2 hour duration. So if we just take 10% as kind of the baseline, so 10 megawatts of solar, you have to install 1 megawatt of battery storage, and then with a 1 to 2 hour duration. These tend to actually be close to the 2 hour duration range. So that means, for every 10 megawatts of solar being installed in China, you're having to install 2 megawatt hours of battery storage as well. Okay. And these are that's kind of like the baseline. So, each province has different targets here. Some provinces are saying 4 hour duration. Some provinces are going up to 20%. But basically, you can kind of almost see it quite clearly, as China is ramping up renewable installations. And this policy really only kicked in the start of 2022. And we saw this market go crazy just because direct requirements for battery storage to be installed as well. So we won't, I don't think it's likely we'll see, details of that clarity of you must install batteries to go alongside renewables in the US market. But it does give a good sense of the sort of requirements that they think are needed in order to have proper integration of renewables on the grid, and to ensure you do have kind of a stable supply. The other thing that we are seeing in China now as well is increasingly renewable farms are kind of banding together. So say you have 3 solar farms located near to each other, rather than each one installing their own individual storage asset, what you'd actually have is just kind of one standalone storage asset but located near to all three of them. And it will just be kind of the combined capacity of the three. And that will kind of interact with all of them, as well as the grid, to provide kind of stability and ensure those renewables are operating properly.
Okay. You mentioned the short duration battery storage. So what is the cutoff? Is it like the 6-hour duration where it then goes into long, or how's that go?
So, I mean, it's a very hot debated topic. I would say no one really has a clear, definite decision of what long duration is. I was at a conference a few days ago, and there was someone from the UK government there on kind of he basically was like head of electricity storage for the UK government. So I asked him, he was talking about long duration. So I was like, so what does the UK government see as long duration? And he avoided the question very well. So, I mean, in general, we would say that long duration is typically, beyond 10 hours is when you start to get into longer duration batteries. That's something that I would say it's not really, there's no obvious kind of barrier for what is long duration and what is short duration. There is almost like a crossover. So you may have something which is 6 hours, which some people would classify that as kind of medium duration, some would classify as short. And what we're increasingly seeing is, technologies kind of move along that scale as well. So historically, I mean, even say 2 years ago, people tend to say for lithium-ion batteries, 4 hours was really the upper limit in terms of duration. But now we're increasingly seeing projects come through with 6 hours, with 8 hours. In China, I've seen even a 10-hour lithium-ion battery project. So that duration kind of classification is being pushed as well. So I wouldn't say there's a clear number.
Well, that's interesting. And honestly, Iola, that makes me feel so much better, because when I was looking into that, I got so many different answers and I just got confused. Yeah. So I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah, definitely.
What about, just real quick, like use case differences for the short duration versus long duration? So for anybody watching, Tesla Megapacks are either 2 or 4 hour duration, so pretty much on the short side. But what are some of the use cases for that longer side when it comes to the duration?
Yeah, so I mean, longer duration, you're starting to look into more kind of seasonal use cases. So I mean, one of the big things being, if you look at the variability of how wind or solar operates during the year, and also energy demand during the year, so electricity demand during the year. So, in the winter, you're going to have lower generation from solar, but maybe demand is higher. But you need something to kind of fill that gap. Then you'd be looking at maybe you can have some kind of seasonal storage. So you start to get things like hydrogen coming into the mix. So it's really just being able to store energy for longer and discharge it over a longer period of time.
Okay. I wanted to loop back to the Tesla and how they may be benefiting right now from these producer tax credits. So is it fair to say then that they're already earning the $10 per kilowatt hour using those cells from CATL, even though they're from China, assembling those into modules or packs? And then they may actually already be getting the $35 per kilowatt hour for making those 4680 cells that are made in the United States. So they're actually kind of already getting the full $45 per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess it's how you really think about each part of the business. So the 4680 cells right now, I mean, their primary kind of end market is for EV. So that's kind of the EV side of the business. But, if you get to a point where any of those cells are going into storage, then it is, for storage as well. I mean, right now, the 4680 cells that are being produced are NCM chemistries. So it's unlikely we'll see those being deployed in energy storage at any point. It would almost be kind of a step back in terms of Tesla's strategy around which cells they're using. But, if we get to a point where Tesla are manufacturing their own LFP cells, which I think is definitely, in the plan for the future, then for sure that kind of $45 per kilowatt hour is kind of feeding into the storage side of the business.
Okay. So that's a good distinction then, that they can be already earning that $35 per kilowatt hour, but on Tesla's side, from an accounting standpoint, whether it's going to reduce the cost of goods sold for the EVs or for the Megapack, that's kind of the differentiator. Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, good deal. So you talked about China briefly. Are you able to share anything on the different incentive programs globally? Like, do places like China and Europe have incentive programs in place like the IRA?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the IRA is definitely I'd say one of the strongest policy levers that we've seen, and support for the storage market. In China, at a national level, I would say there's not too much in terms of support, but once you get to a provincial level, it becomes a lot more popular. These are often more on the kind of generation side. So once a storage asset is in place, you may be able to tap into basically kind of a production from the energy you've generated. So I mean, actually got a few different provinces I can give you.
Cool.
In Qinghai province, basically, if you generate over 540 hours for the year, so basically, if the storage asset is operating for that much, you get 0.1 RMB per kilowatt hour generated. In Northeast China, you get about 0.2 kilowatt hours per 0.2 RMB per kilowatt hour generated. So that's about $30 per megawatt hour that you generate. So over the course of the year, that can add up to a good amount of money. But it is much more on kind of a provincial level. Everyone kind of sets their own level of subsidy or incentive. The European market is a bit different, I would say. Historically, the European market has been relatively slow compared to the movement in the US and in China. And that comes down a lot to a bit of kind of lack of policy support and also lack of cohesion. So one of the big barriers in the European market dates back to a tax directive, which was in place since like 2003. And it was around how storage was classified. And it basically kind of classified storage as both a kind of drawer and a supplier. And what that meant was a double taxation. So you were charged a tax for both supplying energy to the grid and also drawing it, so charging and discharging, which was causing issues for a lot of assets, and which is why we haven't seen much in terms of grid level deployments on mainland Europe. The UK is a slightly different picture. The UK, is operating kind of independently from that. We see a lot of projects come through in the UK, and that really comes from there's quite good in terms of revenue streams. You can tap into the ancillary markets there, but also there was a change in planning at the end of 2020, which basically kind of moved it from a national planning approval process to more like a local planning approval process. So you can basically push through bigger projects at a much more localized level, which help the market in the UK and in Ireland as well, actually. So each market is operating a little bit independently. I think in the EU, we're going to start to see a lot more support in the coming years. So about a month ago now, as part of the EU's Green Deal industrial plan, it's kind of like their reaction to the IRA, they announced a reform of the electricity market design. And there was a lot of mention around storage and how, demand response measures are going to be a big part of the future European grid, and really highlighting the importance of energy storage as well. And they also really released like a 10-point plan on energy storage. And the first one was kind of removal of this double taxation. So there's kind of moves happening in Europe, but not quite the same level of support, particularly on the financing side, as we've seen in the US. There's a European sovereignty fund, which should come out kind of in the summer, I think. And within that, there might be a bit more clarity around how to tap into funds and access some of this money.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's good stuff. Good to know. So are the biggest markets right now China, the United States, Europe? Are those the big three when it comes to these battery energy storage deployments so far? And are there any sleeper locations that should be in that conversation?
Yeah, so China, the US for sure. Europe, it's a bit slower, but it is happening a bit. Other markets that are pretty interesting is the Australian markets. There's a lot of activity going on there. In terms of, mentioned it earlier around the kind of peaker plants and replacement of peaker plants. That's definitely a big market in Australia, but also looking at, the amount of solar that's being added to the Australian grid. Battery storage is going to be a big part of that. There's a few other markets which are pretty interesting as well. So, the Indian market has really strong potential for storage going forwards. It's not quite going yet or quite got there yet, but in 5 years' time, I would say that's going to be one of the big markets, particularly as you kind of look at electricity demand growing in India, as people electrify and people want access to air conditioning, that sort of thing. Another interesting market, which has kind of jumped up on my radar recently, has been the Turkish market. So the Turkish government, or like electricity market regulation, put out kind of a tender for energy storage, and they had over 220 gigawatts of storage kind of sent in this application process. So right now they've only approved, it was like 700 megawatts, so quite small right now, but they said over the next three years, they're basically going to tender about 20 gigawatts of storage. So wow. Yeah, that could be an interesting market to watch over the next few years.
Okay, awesome. So when it comes to these deployments, I mean, what are some of the biggest challenges and drawbacks and hurdles for the industry right now? Is there anything, I guess, what's holding back this market from exploding at this point?
I mean, supply chain, as with everything, is always going to be an issue. So probably the biggest pinch point in this market right now is on the system side. So, I mean, there's lots of cells being produced, particularly, I mean, really in the Chinese market, LFP cells being produced. But in terms of system manufacturing, this is something that the industry is still lacking slightly. There's lots of plans coming and lots of ramp plans. So, I mean, of course, Tesla with 40 gigawatt hours at Lathrop and then another 40 gigawatt hours in Shanghai is going to be good for the market and bring a lot of storage through. Fluence have a few different production facilities, but in general, there's not the amount of systems being produced as potentially that there is demand in the market. Ramping up the system production is going to be a big thing. The other kind of biggest issue facing the market is really around grid connections and kind of wait times for those. So it's easy for anyone to kind of say, okay, I want to install 1 gigawatt hours of battery storage at this location, but ultimately you're going to kind of join a queue to get a grid connection, and you may be waiting for a number of years before you kind of get the permission, get the planning, get the permitting approved, but then also get the actual grid connection built out as well. So it takes time for these things.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any argument whatsoever for keeping any of the legacy system in the long term? Obviously, this is going to take a long time to replace, but in terms of moving forward with battery energy storage, to keep some of these, fossil fuel peaker plants or that legacy system, or is it pretty much 100% battery energy storage is the way?
I mean, I think that in general, fossil fuels will be part of a future electricity grid that we do have. I think it's going to be very difficult to go 100%, renewable, 100% battery storage. One thing that we will start to see more is, integrated carbon capture and storage to go alongside any kind of fossil fuel generation. It's going to be very hard, and it's going to take a long time to get to a point where 100% of the grid is green. But removing carbon in some form is going to be a big part of the future grid. And then, of course, you always need to have some kind of base load of energy generation. So things like nuclear are kind of potential to be a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. So if you were leading Tesla, where are you putting the next Megapack factory? They have one in Lathrop. They just announced one in Shanghai. So where are you putting the third one, given what you know?
I mean, Europe is probably the obvious place to go. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see an announcement in Berlin or somewhere else in Europe in the coming months or year. I wouldn't be at all surprised by that. I think, with Lathrop, you're supplying the US market, US domestic market. The demand is significant there. That's all you're really going to be able to do with that one facility. The facility in Shanghai, speaking to some of my Chinese colleagues there, their understanding is that it's really going to be for export rather than the domestic market. And the idea there being, I mean, you can supply basically into the rest of Asia, you can supply Australia, and also potentially supply into Europe as well. So then the obvious step really is to have a facility in Europe. so you can supply the European markets. And then maybe that does free up some capacity for domestic supply in China as well for Megapacks. I mean, right now there are a lot of pretty successful energy storage system players in the Chinese market. So Tesla's going to, have to compete with these, have to be price competitive. So that's going to be, harder, maybe potentially harder market to break into than just exporting to Europe or exporting to Australia.
Okay, interesting. So that leads me to a question that I had talking about the competitive landscape. I mean, as an industry insider like yourself, I mean, what's the narrative around Tesla? Are they the clear leader in a place like the United States, or globally? Are they just one of the players? Do they still have stuff to prove? Kind of where do they fall in that hierarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say right now they're one of the players. They're one of the leading players in the Western markets. But there's still, a lot of potential for other players to kind of come through on top, or similarly for Tesla to kind of run away with things and be the all-out leader. I mean, in the US market, some of the biggest players, I guess, are the likes of kind of like Fluence, Canadian Solar, Powin, Nidec, ABB. There's a really long list of players that are supplying systems. So ultimately it comes down to who can manufacture the most. And, Tesla's been the most ambitious in terms of its production capacity plans. So that really does set them in quite a good position for, taking some level of kind of market dominance or leadership in the US and Western markets. So, I'd say it's quite a diverse landscape right now. It's also quite an interesting one, because if we go back 2 years ago, cell manufacturers weren't really involved in the system space. So really they were just supplying to EVs, and then any batteries they already had left over were just sent into stationary storage. But a lot of the cell manufacturers are moving into the system space as well. So, with this level of vertical integration, it's possible for them to maybe do things cheaper than Tesla can, where they're purchasing cells. So I think a big part of whether or how successful Tesla is in storage really comes down to whether they start producing their own cells as well. Because I think, you've really got to be integrated across those two parts to be able to compete with, say, CATL, who can do both cell and system.
Can you say that the market is big enough for multiple players, specifically in the United States, for the next few years, to where basically whatever these companies are making, they're pretty much going to sell it? And, at what point may that change where you really have to be like the best of the best for these companies to pick your product?
Yeah, I mean, looking at kind of our demand forecasts out to 2030, 2040, and also looking at kind of renewable forecasts along that timescale, this isn't a market which is going to slow down at any point in the next few years. So there's definitely room for lots of different players. And, you can make comparisons with the EV market or with the vehicle market. Multiple operators can succeed and multiple OEMs can succeed. So I definitely don't think it's going to be a case of one player dominating necessarily. But, the demand is really significant, and it's going to continue to be significant. So I think there's definitely a strong opportunity for multiple players.
If you had to pick either your favorite two or the two companies you think are poised to kind of emerge as the leaders over the next few years, first in North America and then maybe second over in China, like, do you have two companies that stand out?
Yeah, I mean, probably the ones who are kind of the biggest and make the most noise, it would of course be Tesla in the US, and Fluence probably the other player, which is really making a lot of good progress and has quite significant expansion plans as well. There's a number of other US players who are really just getting started. Particularly, I think some of the really interesting ones are those who are just setting up gigafactories. So Arnex Energy, Core Power, they both have ambitious plans for gigafactories, and alongside that, kind of having integrated system manufacturing. So that's definitely, those are kind of interesting ones to watch in that sense. In the Chinese market, I mean, it's pretty diverse. A lot of the players who are doing very well come from a more like renewable background. So players like Jinko Solar, they come from a really strong footing in the solar industry, and that's allowing them to kind of make moves in storage as well. But probably the biggest players over there are kind of the names that you kind of all know from cell manufacturing. So CATL, BYD are really, if they've got the cell capacity and they can do it themselves, then it's almost, you kind of question why they would bother selling cells when they can just build a system and sell at a premium. So it's
Yeah, makes sense. So you touched on that might be a challenging market for Tesla to break into, the Chinese one. Is it just from a cost standpoint, or is it the government kind of encouraging their home players, or what do you think those biggest challenges are for Tesla in that market specifically, and why you think they'll be exporting more from that Shanghai Megapack factory than actually supplying to the local market?
Yeah, from chatting with my Chinese colleagues, the main point they see is the cost point. Just being cost competitive is going to be difficult, and that's really the primary driver for selecting a system. You go for the most affordable one, so that's probably going to be the biggest thing.
Okay.
And you can just really imagine that if you have a CATL system or you have CATL cells in a Tesla system, which one is going to be cheaper? It's which way people are going to go. So that could be the kind of big point there.
Okay. Yep, that makes sense. Can you touch on the battery chemistries a bit? I know you touched on the market kind of moving toward LFP. Maybe what percentage of the market right now is LFP? Is sodium ion at all ready to be a player in the storage space? I know that's just starting to trickle out into the EV realm with BYD and CATL. So what's that look like right now?
Yeah. Firstly on the kind of lithium ion market. So this is kind of the dominant chemistry in stationary storage right now. You do have a few other chemistries which take little pieces of the picture, but it really is predominantly a lithium ion story right now. If we go back to kind of 2020, the market was basically 50-50 split between NCM, so nickel, cobalt, manganese, and 50% LFP, so lithium iron phosphate. And last year, that was closer to about 75-80% LFP. And that was something that really shifted on the back of a number of different things, but cost being one of the big ones, safety being one of the other big ones. And then also really a kind of shift in strategies from the OEMs and from the cell manufacturers as well. So the way this market was operating back in 2020 was really a surplus market. So if you think about what cells Tesla was using in its energy storage products at that point, it was primarily whatever they were using in their EVs as well. And then kind of just the batteries that were left over almost got filtered into their storage products. And then you had a number of battery fires happen. So you had the Victoria big battery fire, which, scared a lot of people. That was definitely a big concern for the market, how this was going to, impact the market. And on the back of that, I wouldn't say that was the primary driver, but it was almost a turning point for a lot of the industry. We saw a lot of developers saying, we're only going to use LFP cells from now on. And then, Tesla announced their strategy to shift to LFP. And a lot of other players followed suit as well. So, this market has really, in the last 2 years, shifted quite significantly towards LFP. If you look at certain markets in particular, so in China, it's closer to like 95% LFP. And they actually have some policy around technology choice as well. So last year, the National Energy Administration, they put out a draft. So this isn't kind of concrete. It was just a proposal, basically to ban NCM batteries in large scale energy storage. So this wouldn't actually have much of an impact in China because everything is basically LFP anyway. But you can imagine if China's kind of mandating around what technologies should be used, this is going to have a knock-on effect to other markets as well. And then the other big thing we're seeing with LFP chemistries is really kind of advancements around the size of these cells being manufactured. So increasingly we're seeing kind of the voltage being pushed up and also the amp hours being pushed up in terms of these cell formats. So I think last year CATL came out with their 280 amp hour system or amp hour cells. That's a single cell, 280 amp hours. And what that did was, you've got a larger cell, so basically you've got less moving parts for the whole system, so you're bringing down costs. It also allows you to kind of start to play around with the cycle life. So cycle life is kind of one of the most important things for storage, because you want this asset to last as long as possible. So they came out with their products last year, which were about 8,000 cycles. And then in the last few months, we've seen a number of other players come out with their cells, which are pushing that format even larger. So I think the biggest one right now is EVE Energy, and they have a 560 amp hour cell. And with that, they're reporting about 12,000 cycles. So I've seen estimates that should last about 30 years as a system. So increasingly seeing that kind of these advancements being made to kind of larger format cells, specifically for stationary storage. And these are all LFP. So, you can really see how that market is going in terms of within lithium ion, the chemistry is being used. Outside of the lithium ion batteries, there are a number of different chemistries which are interesting and have good potential. There are lots and lots and lots of different ones that are all kind of at the novel early stage. Some of them are publicly listed, some of them are getting a bit of attention, but they're all relatively early stage. Then you have probably the two which are the kind of furthest progressed right now, flow batteries. So these tend to be kind of vanadium flow batteries, which are the most popular ones. Primarily in China, there's a lot of activity going on there. But again, these are still relatively pilot stage. At a cost point, they're more expensive than lithium ion right now. They do have potential to kind of be cheaper and be cost competitive, but relatively early stage still. And then the other big one is sodium ion batteries. So these are really quite interesting for stationary storage, and we think they have potential to be quite a big market disruptor in terms of the chemistry being used. So it really comes down to kind of a few key things. So firstly, on the cost side, so sodium is cheaper than lithium, particularly when lithium prices are high, it's cheaper than sodium. Lithium prices have come down a lot now, so that cost differential is maybe not as big as people thought it was going to be a few months ago. But the cost is a big thing. Safety is another big thing. So, these batteries are safer than lithium ion, safer than LFP. There's a number of other things which are really useful. So you can fully discharge a sodium ion cell. So it makes it really good for transporting it. You can also use aluminium as the current collector instead of copper. So that's another thing which is cheaper. So there's a whole range of things that make these cheaper and make these safer. So good potential for this market. Right now, it's it is early stages. We are seeing lots of announcements come through in China, but it will take time for this technology both to be kind of trusted in the market and also deployed. So probably the leading player now in terms of a cell manufacturer is a company called Hainar Battery. So they have a 1 gigawatt hour gigafactory, and they're planning to expand that to, I think, around 6 gigawatt hours by the end of the year. And they have a number of offtake agreements with different kind of OEMs and also integrators. And they're planning to install a 60 megawatt hour battery in China. That's coming online this year. So that's the kind of biggest sodium ion energy storage project, which is in the pipeline right now. So they're kind of the leading player right now, and they're making the most progress. Of course, there's lots of news around CATL, and CATL, they displayed their sodium ion battery at Shanghai Auto. So we're going to see more and more of it start to come through. I think one thing that we've really noticed is, particularly speaking to a lot of the Western integrators, is they're quite resistant to take on a new technology at this time. So I think what we'll see is deployments in China come a lot faster than deployments anywhere else. So, in China, we can expect to see sodium ion projects come through in the next few years. But in Europe and in the US, it's going to take a few more years for it to trickle through. And that really comes down to just kind of the integrators trusting the technology and really knowing what they're getting into. They've just got used to LFP, so they're not sure about a whole new technology. Is the big thing there. I guess the other thing to add is that BYD announcement, that's still a rumor. So everyone's been throwing that around like that's fact. But just to clarify, that's BYD denied that rumor. So the Seagull is LFP cells, not sodium ion.
Interesting. I'm glad you said that. I literally just talked about that in my video yesterday, so I'm gonna have to
Yeah.
update that. Good stuff. Yeah, that's awesome information. So thank you for that. Do you have any insight into why Tesla isn't making LFP cells now? Does it have anything to do with those patents that they could only be made in China for a while, or are you not sure?
Yeah, I think that probably was a big factor for it, and is why we haven't seen much LFP capacity in general in the US market. I think as well, if you go back 2 years ago, no one really thought LFP was going to be used in EVs. There was this idea that it was not the energy density wasn't high enough, and NCM was just better. So the investment wasn't really made in terms of further up the supply chain as well. So in terms of LFP cathode production, you don't really have much of that going on in the US market either.
Iola, what are you most excited for in this space? It doesn't have to be battery energy storage, just anything at all, what you're doing on a daily basis, what you're seeing. What are you most excited for over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think the big thing is this market is really just getting started. So, we're going to see some really impressive growth over the next few years. I mean, what I do day to day, I'm looking at both the EV market and the stationary storage side of things, and both these markets seem to be at somewhat of an inflection point where things are really just starting to get going. So yeah, lots of growth in the next few years for sure.
Well, Iola, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much for sharing all of this knowledge and wisdom with us. It's been greatly appreciated. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.